Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this meeting of the Standards and General Purposes Committee. This is our first meeting under the new arrangements, actually. We're now gone down from 9 members to 7 members, in fact, because of the council reduced in size, so we've correspondingly had to reduce a little bit in size. We're now live streaming on YouTube. My name is Councillor Andy MacLeod, and I'm the chairman of the committee. I'm accompanied by my Vice Chair, Councillor John Rubini. Please keep statements reasonably brief and to the point, as 6 members have registered to speak tonight. Leila, can you advise if there have been any apologies?
Yep, I've had apologies from Councillor Nicholson.
Thank you. Have there been any declarations of interest?
No, none received.
Any questions from members of the public?
No, none received.
Any questions from members of the council?
None received.
Thank you. So let's move forward to our first substantive item, which is the proposed revision to the scheme of delegation to officers and councillors and the planning code of good conduct. So if I could actually hand over to Claire Elton-Brown, our Executive Head of Planning, to present the report.
Point of information, Chairman, aren't you missing minutes and things?
We should have actually done that. It's not on my script actually, but never mind. You're absolutely right, Councillor Ward. Have any members got any points they'd like to make about the minutes of the last meeting? Is that a no? So are members happy that I signed the minutes of the last meeting after this meeting?
Agreed.
Agreed? Okay. Sorry about that. Now passed over to Claire to present the report.
Thank you, Chair. Can I just put up the PowerPoint slides? I've just got 3 PowerPoints that just summarise sort of main changes in the content of the planning code of good practice. So whilst I'm just waiting, I'll just confirm the recommendation. So the recommendation is that the committee this evening are asked to recommend that the council approve the revised scheme of delegation, the planning committee procedures rules as amended, the planning code of good practice, and also that there is a consultation with all councillors to agree the content of a memorandum of understanding between planning officers and councillors. Oh, okay, fine. I'm actually not going to do a PowerPoint, but just to confirm to committee this evening, the key changes to the scheme of delegation is that the previous scheme had a trigger where any application over 25 dwellings automatically came to committee. I think that was a historic trigger when there was a completely different committee structure, so it's recommended that goes. It's also recommended that at the moment members have only 21 days from the publication of the weekly list to call in applications to committee. It's recommended that that is deleted to sort of reduce the pressure on members to call things in. Other key changes are suggested that where there are over 10 objections to a householder application and there's a officer recommendation contrary to the objections. So normally if there's objections then the officer is likely to be recommending approval. That triggers it being called to committee. And similarly for larger applications, major applications, the trigger would be 20 objections. The planning code of conduct would just set it out for everybody, and it's not just for members and officers, it's also for a lot of our customers, our regular agents, our residents, so that everybody's clear what to expect from the council and the way we will behave and manage our business in relation to planning matters. So that would cover a range of things, including training, disclosure and registration of interest, how we deal with pre-apps, call-ins, committee, and also committee site visits. And then finally, what I'm proposing, and this is really on the back of the discussion that we had at last committee around forming stronger working relationships between officers and members, that members are asked to suggest items that might be on a memorandum of understanding between officers and members. And I've suggested in the appendix some possible things that could be in that, which would be sort of more from my side. So, you know, officers will speak to councillors and highlight applications that are beginning to be controversial, so that you've got that, you know, it well within your vision, and can be mindful of that in the discussions you may be having in your communities about those applications. Again, an open invite for councillors to contact officers at any time to discuss any planning matter, and similarly for me to make sure that officers respond to those points of contact, and you know, have that open discussion at any point during the life of an application that will help both you but also help the officers understand where ward members particularly may be coming from on a particular application. That we'll be doing briefings with all members on complex applications, so not just planning committees, because obviously the larger strategic applications tend to have sort of wider implications, strategic implications for the borough, and therefore it's important that members are cited on them and understand the long-term implications of some of the things within schemes, and also that we will seek to arrange short meetings with ward members when there are appeals that are in their area, so that they're sort of cited on the appeal and have a understanding of how that might be managed, and the sort of matters that may or may not be discussed, particularly aware in the cases of hearings and inquiries, sometimes reasons for refusal do fall away, and it's really important that members are fully cited on what is going to be the council's case way in advance of inquiries. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Claire. We have 6 speakers registered to speak this evening. The first is Councillor Peter Clark, who I believe is coming through to us on Zoom. So if you can start, you've got 4 minutes, Peter. Thank you. I think you're muted, Peter.
Thank you, Chair. I was just saying, I know that I exceeded my 4 minutes on the last occasion, so I'll be even briefer this evening. First of all, thank you for the opportunity to address the committee as a ward councillor. One of the items on this evening's agenda is the councillor's planning code of good conduct. The suggestion I'd like to make to the Standards Committee to consider is on this subject, but it could equally sit within the proposed memorandum of understanding between planning officers and councillors. Over the past few years, we have seen some applications coming before planning committees where members who called in the application have not attended the committee in person. I believe this does not show a common courtesy to the committee, but more importantly, it does also not show due consideration to the applicant in question, who is, after all, their ward resident. The role of ward councillors should not simply stop when the application has been called in. As ward councillors, they should properly engage with the planning process from start to finish. So the suggestion I'd like the committee to consider is as follows. Councillors having requested an application be taken to the planning committee will be notified of the date on which the item will come before the committee and will be expected to attend, and by addressing the committee, explain their views on the planning application and expand upon their call-in reasons. If the councillor is unavailable on that particular date, they would arrange for a proxy councillor to do the same. This would result in far greater engagement with the planning process and would of course ensure that ward councillors in question give greater consideration to the merits or otherwise of their committee call-in. That's it from me, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. The next speaker is Councillor David Beeman. David, again, you've got 4 minutes to speak.
Oh, I won't be taking 4 minutes, Chair, don't worry. Right, first of all, may I stress, I fully support the suggested revisions to the scheme of delegation to officers and councillors and the council's planning code of good conduct being considered by tonight's meeting. But there are a few points of detail on which I'd like to make the following comments. With regard to the Code of Conduct on Appendix 3A, the proposed Code of Good Practice states that pre-committee site visits should be scheduled to be held on the Tuesday before any planning committee meeting, paragraph 20.4. In order to provide more flexibility when arranging site visits, could consideration please be given to extending the days when site visits can be made to also include Friday, Monday, and possibly even Wednesday morning, in addition to the one single day, Tuesday. The second minor point I want to make is when site visits are arranged, local ward councillors should also be advised and have the right to attend any site visit. If acceptable, this would require an additional short clause to be included in the Code of Good Practice. The third point is rather pedantic, I'm afraid. This proposed Code of Good Practice refers mainly to chair and vice chair, although there's at least one reference to chairman, 21.11. I'm sure this is certainly an unintentional, and I appreciate rather pedantic point. The proposed Code of Practice should be consistent throughout and not use different titles for the same person. Finally, with regard to the scheme of delegation, I understand that there is a number of local planning authority areas, such as Suffolk Coastal, where objections by town and parish council will automatically be called in for determination by planning committees, provided such objections are supported by valid planning reasons. I would therefore request that consideration is given to implementing a similar right for town and parish councils in Waverley. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Our next speaker is Councillor Jerry Hyman, who I believe is available via Zoom.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Chairman. Yes, well, I'm not sure that all members of the committee are aware, but the essence of this item here was thrown out only last October at a full revision of the Constitution. This looks like Groundhog Day to me. Again, we've got another full revision of the Constitution and one every year to do, apparently. That's coming up in the next item. In this, the issue here is increasing the number of letters of objection or support that will be needed to get a committee to refer to committee so that they can look at the issues with the officer reports where people think that there are good planning reasons to go against the officer's recommendation. We've got no evidence here whatsoever that this is the right approach for us to take at this time. We're putting the cart before the horse quite clearly. I mean, the idea here is that we're going to improve decision making and efficiency, but we've done absolutely no scrutiny whatsoever of the real problems that we've got. And the problem that we've got, one thing I think we've been told quite clearly in the council's response to the Secretary of State earlier in the year, and in all the documentation that we've seen over the past couple of months in respect of the planning problems at Waverley, the issues here actually came from particular issues during COVID and people working from home and having problems with not writing letters to the developers, asking for extensions of time. And it looks to me like we're solving a problem that we don't have, and in doing so we are snubbing residents when we are snubbing councillors, giving all the power to, as far as residents are concerned, unaccountable officers. And we need to make sure that the accountability is there first, that recommendation 4 comes before the others, so that we have the rules and the memorandum of understanding in place, so that residents know that we and they will be able to hold this council to account in its decision making, which they can't at the moment. We will absolutely need to make sure that recommendation 4 comes first, not some sort of, oh, we'll agree some rules later. because we won't see those rules as we didn't after the last time. And we did do this only 8 months ago, and it was thrown out because we do not want, particularly in the rural boroughs, where finding 10 for householder applications or 25 people who want to call it in would be very difficult in some rural areas, even for the most objectionable planning applications. So I really think that we need to be doing this the other way around. The members simply do not have evidence in front of them to tell them, to advise them what are the right measures that we should be taking to solve our planning problems. Because there is absolutely no evidence when we've got 95 to 98% of all our applications are delegated to officers. Elsewhere, it's 90% on average, I gather, across the country, and we're right up one of the best. Why on earth would we want to alienate councillors and residents unnecessarily? Obviously, the more eyes that look at applications, the better, and the less problems we'll get. And we're doing the opposite to this. So it's quite obvious, as a matter of principle, we're stopping people from contributing to this. We're stopping people from or at least putting them off from engaging, because it's so much harder for them to take part. I think this is completely wrong, as it always has been and has always been recognised to be. And I think that we should leave things as they are until we know what the problems really are that we need to sort. There are good changes. Obviously, there are some changes in here which need doing, but I would point out that page 47 says we've got 5 residents' objection of support in Appendix 3A, the Planning Code of Good Practice we're adopting, which is the opposite to what we're saying in Recommendation 1. We can't do both of them. You know, they contradict each other. So if you agree to all of them, you're disagreeing with yourselves. So please, bring this back when it's been worked on properly and when we've got some sort of accountability in place before we give all the powers to the officers to make these decisions without any accountability, because there is no evidence that councillors are the problem here and that the scheme of delegation has any problem in it for us. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Jerry. Our next speaker is Councillor George Hess.
Thank you, Chair. Actually, Jerry Hyman has covered pretty much what I was going to say. I'm just concerned about increasing the number of objections from 5 to 10, and on household applications, and on major or minor non-household applications, increasing it from 5 to 20. Or more letters of objection. I think this bar is being set too high. And as Jerry said, it would make it difficult if you're out in the country with not many neighbours to find that many people to support you with letters of objection. So I'm just concerned that the bar is being set too high, and I don't know why it just doesn't remain at the existing number of 5. Thank you, Chair.
Right, thank you, George. Our next speaker is Councillor Maxine Gale. Maxine.
Thank you, Chair. I think it's all been said, but I'd like to just say it again, because I'm here to speak for the villages where it's very difficult to find 10 people to get together to write in. There are many applications out in the sticks where a farmer may want to change a dwelling into, I don't know, a B&B or something. I'm not sure if that would come under householder or major or minor, but if it came under major and minor because it had more rooms, it would need 20 objections from people. I think it should stay at 5. I was part of the committee that debated this last time, and we were all unanimous that it should stay at 5, purely because we do live in an area where there are some very far-flung houses from other properties. Thank you.
Thank you, Maxine. Our final speaker on this item is Councillor Paul Follis.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and good evening, everyone. The portfolio holder, Councillor Townsend, is unable to be here this evening. So on behalf of the executive, I would just like to offer my general support, both for this process we're embarking on here, and specifically trying to reach a new codified understanding between officers and members. I think it's long overdue that we get this right, and I think will serve us all very well. I personally come from the same position as my colleague Councillor Clark, in that I firmly believe that the opportunity for members to engage formally with the planning process, and in particularly the non-planning committee members, should be maximised as much as possible. And I also strongly believe that all members should have clarity on the reasons why an application has been called in by a member. I think the particular point that Councillor Clark raised for the mechanic of doing that is something that should be part of that memorandum of understanding, and therefore subject to debate here and with other members. But I do think it should be clear to members in committee why somebody has called something in, partly so that it's not just arbitrary, but also so that there is actually a planning basis being discussed. Just going to some of the points raised by others, Councillor Hyman, there are existing rules and accountability and mechanisms for achieving that. I think I feel obligated to remind everybody here that the problem, such as it is not exclusively members or exclusively officers. We all have a particular part in this where we've got to come to some slightly different arrangements to make sure this works best for both. It's not even both sides, works for the council and all the components of that council. In terms of what's being proposed, though, in terms of the detail, officers here have put a start for 10 up for debate, and I'm sure that the Standards Committee will debate the merits of neighbour objections 5, 10, 25, etc. I think for me the crux of the point here is that whilst Councillor Gale, you are absolutely right, there are going to be areas where even finding 20 residents that are neighbours of a particular application will be physically impossible. The remedy to that particular potential injustice is that the ward councillor can call it in. So whilst there isn't an automatic call in because of these thresholds, the remedy is always that the ward councillor can call it in. It's also, I think for me, then the issue is making sure the ward councillors are appropriately aware of these things that are going on so that they can interact in the process in a timely and useful way. My fear is that if we reduce it, the automatic level down, things will get through the cracks where a ward councillor might not be aware of it. So for me, it's establishing the balance between making ward councillors fully aware of what's going on in a timely fashion, whilst not removing all of the other checks and balances in the process. And if we can find a happy medium between that, I think we'll be in a good place. And just going to Councillor Beamon's comments, and I know Councillor Williams would ask me after the carry-out application in his ward last week to ask this, that pre-committee site visits with ward members should be an absolute fundamental, and I think we shouldn't be taking things to committee without the ward member in question having either agreed to attend or having formally passed on the opportunity to do so in writing. Because I think really the perspective of the ward councillor on the ground is something that we should be taking seriously, and as far as I'm concerned should be in the rules. As to your last comment, Councillor Beaman, I would absolutely love towns and parishes to be able to be part of that call-in process, but I do think that would complicate matters. I would propose to any towns and parishes who are wanting to be more involved in the process, the approach at Godalming Town Council, for example, is that the council's planning committee will formally ask a ward borough councillor to call something in, at which point that borough councillor can come to a judgment based on their experience, the planning rules, and what else is going on. So I would certainly recommend that towns and parishes take a more active approach with their relevant borough members to achieve the outcomes that they're after. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to listening to the debate.
Thank you, Paul. Before we get into the debate, Claire, I think it'd be worthwhile to give you the opportunity to respond to some of the interesting points made. And let's sort of categorise them. If you could start by talking about what Councillor Clark and Councillor Follow said about members being expected to attend the meeting and whether we should be revising our procedures in some way to ensure that that happens.
Yeah, I think that's a very sensible suggestion, so that everybody is clear, including the member that may have called it in, not realising that they should have attended committee, because I don't think it reflects well sometimes if there's a call in and everybody's looking around saying, why is it called in? Who called it in? Yeah. So I think that's a really positive suggestion.
Yeah. We specifically need to do in terms of the documents that we have in front of us. Do we need to make any adjustments?
I think we will need to just review what's written, and then look to add that the council requesting planning committees notified and expected to attend, and that should be in the code of conduct.
Thanks, Claire. So let's do that. Secondly, there was the points made by Councillor Beaman to do with site visits and other issues. Would you like to respond to them?
I think it's helpful that we have a day that we've identified that is the day we will try and carry out the site visit, but also acknowledging that it may be that the applicant may not be available on the Tuesday, or it may be that as part of the site visit you're wanting to visit the neighbour's properties, somebody they might not be. So to give us flexibility, I think we should look at rewording to say would aim to be on a Tuesday, but for practical reasons, it may need to take place on either the Friday or the Monday.
Thanks, Claire. Then there was the various points made by Councillor Hyman, supported to a degree by Councillor Hess and Councillor Gale, although Councillor Hyman made some additional points of his own. So if we could take the ones that people were particularly concerned about, the number of objections, and the fact that it might be difficult to get that number of objections. I think Councillor Follows has actually answered the point himself, but if you would like to say what you think and then perhaps address the additional points that Councillor Hyman was making.
Yeah, so definitely Councillor Follows has answered or made a suggestion that the ward member is able to call in. I would reflect that as a council, we do receive a very high number of letters on planning applications, much higher than I've seen in other councils. So there's definitely engagement in planning across the borough. But yeah, that ward councillor call in, I think, answers that issue around those rural settlements where there may be something that members feel is important enough to be considered by a planning committee, and the ward member can then call it in. In terms of Councillor Hyman's other questions, well, I don't think I could probably comment on the fact that officers aren't accountable, other than I'm sitting in front of you being accountable. So I'll probably just leave it at that.
Okay. Say thank you, Claire. I actually think you've answered the points pretty well. I agree with the point that councillors can call in the applications even where we don't get to the number. And we've got such a varied borough with very large towns and small villages. I'm not sure we could come up with a number that would satisfy everybody. So I think the number being suggested is reasonable, and that in terms of the answer to the problem is the one that members can call in where necessary. So and I agree with what you said about accountability in terms of Councillor Hyman's points. So let's get over to the discussion with committee members. I think first of all, Councillor Goodrich.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I presume we're going to go through all the documents rather than one at a time, because that's how it's been presented. Can I say that the one thing I very much approve of is the removal of having to call in after within 21 days of the list being published, because that has been a nightmare for councillors, in fact, because you don't know when you see it on paper whether this is contentious or not. You then see the objections coming in, and we're busy people, so you don't spend every minute looking at every application to see how the objectors are going on. And I tend to call in when the parish council writes to me, or writes to the council and writes to me at the same time saying this is contentious, could you please call it in? So that's good. A question mark, should there be some time limit for call-in? Because otherwise you can call it in any old time, right up to the day before the officer's about to make a decision, for example. So I raise that as a question, that should there be something in the rules that says there's a time limit to do it? I mean, it may be that we're waiting to see if it gets to 10 and it's got to 9 and stuck. So you then decide to call it in, hoping you wouldn't have to do it. I agree entirely that if you do call it in, you should attend the meeting and you should attend the site visit. I mean, it seems to me if you bring the thing to the forefront, then it's your duty as a ward councillor to actually see it through. Albeit you can't debate and vote, but at least you can do your bit to get it in. The time limit of 10 and 15, I hear what's being said, that if you don't reach the number, well, you can just call it in. But of course, the call in is subject to the head of planning. And of course, Claire is brilliant, but she may not have someone so brilliant next time round. But you're relying on one officer to say, yes, you can call it in or not. And it's then interpretation as to whether that is right. And in the previous rules, if I'm right, it was also the chairman of the planning committee that was also involved in that decision. So there was a little bit of member involvement in that. And I see that's disappeared, which does cause me some concern. There's also, and I'd be grateful if it could be explained to me how this works with the 5-day, with the speaking at a planning meeting, when it makes it clear, as the rules have not been changed, that it will be subject to public speaking if there are 5 objectors. So we have 5 there. On the basis, I suppose, that if you've managed to call it in or it's reached 10, then you've got more, obviously more than 5. But I suppose if a member called it in and there was 6 people who had objected, then it would be subject to public speaking. But it didn't worry us before because it was 5 for calling it in, 5 for public speaking. Now we've got 2 numbers, and I'd quite like to know how that is going to work in practice. Otherwise, I think the calling in is fine. If I could move on to the procedure rules, because this is something which I wanted done so that we had better procedure rules for the conduct of a committee meeting. Where I'm slightly adrift here is when we come on page 28 to, we have the new 2.12. So to begin the planning committee's consideration of planning application, the chair will ask the committee if they have any questions for planning officers or legal representatives. So you ask your questions. As an aside, most councillors don't know the difference between asking a question and debating. They'll go on for a long chat about what they think about it and then tag a question on at the end. But then it says at the conclusion of the questions, the chair will ask the committee for a motion to approve or whatever. If everybody's asked questions and been totally online and ask questions without expressing any opinion, how can the feeling of the meeting be obtained as to whether they wish to raise an alternative motion to that is the officer's recommendation? Surely there should be some debate before, debate after the questions. But in practice on Eastern, we basically merge the questions and the debate into one because it's quicker. Because everybody then had 2 bites of the cherry. They'd ask the questions and then they come back and say, well, I'd now like to express my view on this application and so on. And I think I would change 2.12 to have questions or debate. And then once you've had questions and debate, it will be clear. And I think this is what the PAC, Planning Advisory Service, had in mind, that once the chairman gets a feeling that the committee are not going the way the officer has been recommending, then the chairman takes a motion as to whether someone wants to raise a motion. But I'm not quite sure how chairman can get the feel of the meeting if we've only has to make his mind up, his or her mind up, at the time of questions being finished. So a practicality there that I can see could be a problem. And the procedure rules also does not say anything about members of the committee must be present throughout the entire debate and item. And that has caused problems with some people who have turned up 3 minutes late. Maybe the main act hasn't started, but it's been introduced by the officer for 3 minutes or 2 minutes, and that's when they've arrived at the end of that. And there ought to be something, in my view, in the procedure rules that makes it clear that members must be there throughout the debate. Otherwise, they can't vote. I mean, they can take part in the debate, as I understand it, but they can't vote. And I think that should be abundantly clear to members and the members of the public, if I'm right, which I think I am. So that's what I had on the procedure rules, as far as I can recall. Can I move on to the code of good practice, which I think is fine?
Would it help you, Michael, if Claire answered, because you're introducing a lot of the points, would it help you if Claire answered the ones you made so far?
If that would be what you wish, yes.
I think it'd be helpful to everybody, because you made a lot of very good points, and I think if Claire could get the chance to answer them, and then we'll come back to you.
Thank you, because I might have forgotten some of them by the end.
Sorry.
Okay, so the first point was really around the call-in time and that there's no time limit, and that is something that we did have some debate about as officers. I think that's something that should be picked up in the memorandum of understanding, and it would have to be as soon as reasonably practical, because you might have amendments and subsequent, or it may be that some of the consultation responses are really slow coming through. And I think it's just finding the right balance at, what point in time do you as members have enough information to either prompt you to call it in or say, no, in your minds that you don't need to. So I'd suggest that we look at that and rather than making it prescriptive and trip ourselves up potentially, that we do reasonably practical. And if there is that discussion as well going on with case officers on the more controversial ones, that might be sooner rather than later anyway. So the next one, was the point that you made about question and debate, and yes, debate needs to be in there, because without the debate, we won't know. So that we'll add that at paragraph 2.12. And then your next point was also one, sorry, can't read my own note of what you said, which was also
attending the meeting.
Decision.
Attending meeting and being present.
But present, yeah, and that members have to be present for the whole debate, because otherwise they're making a decision on half the information. So again, we'll add that to the procedure note. Yeah, so the decision to call in. So the reason why we'd taken out the chair was in the absence of the chair being available or other issues. I think if a member has called something to committee, I can't think of a situation where I've ever said, no, it can't come to committee, with a member and saying that they want it to come to committee, because there must be something of importance that ward member wants it to come. And I think I've worked in other authorities where the scheme of delegation, that decision to, if a member calls it, then it's that the case officers can put it straight, take it straight through to the agenda. I mean, I think it's up to the committee to decide whether they want that to be in consultation with the chair of the planning committee.
Yeah, can I just deal with that point, Chairman? I think from the rules, and I haven't got it right in front of you, you had to satisfy the head of planning that there was a good planning reason. And therefore I was anticipating on the way it was written that if the head of planning, joint head of planning decided that I don't think that's a good planning reason, then you would be refused your call in. Sometimes, but rarely, one wants to call it in just so the objectors can actually see why it's being, public can see why it's going to be refused, for example. But as I understood it, I mean, in a lot of these planning things, particularly, and I'm a councillor in a rural area with Greenbelt and AONB and AGLV and all that stuff, and there's always, are there very special reasons? And that's a balancing act as to whether there are special reasons or not. And officer may have one view, local member may have a different view, committee may have a third view, which is why I was concerned that actually I was anticipating the head of planning would be refusing quite a lot of call-ins, because presumably to try and streamline planning process. But because the problem on numbers again, which I should have made clear before, because I'm in a rural area, for example, you get a planning application for a barn in the middle of the countryside to make it a dwelling, which, hot potato so far as the rural community is concerned. Nobody overlooks it, nobody sees it, but it is in AONB and it's in all those sort of things. And you won't get 10 objectors in the rural situation because there aren't 10 neighbours, which is very different if you're in the middle of a town where you've upset everybody in the road. So, I mean, an arbitrary 10 or 50 or 20, depending on the type of application, is one thing. But if you're saying, well, if the member calls it in, then that will be fine because it's highly likely the head of planning will go along with the member, then I'm not so worried. But it's what it says in print, which is that you have to be, or the head of planning has to be satisfied that there are good planning reasons, and that might be debatable. So that was my thinking behind it.
Come back. on
Yeah,
that,
I understand what you're saying, but there would still need to be good planning reasons, and the discussion then between the head of planning and the chair would be, are there good planning reasons? Yes, no. So I think we're probably still in the same conversation, and that same judgment is just a conversation between two people rather than just, because it'd still be, are there good planning reasons?
Yeah.
And that would be the conversation with the chair as well with.
But it doesn't say in the rules that the head of planning has to consult the chairman of planning.
No, but I'm saying in that if that was added, and obviously it's for the committee to make a decision on, if it was added, the conversation with the chair of planning committee between the head of planning and the chair would still be around that, are there good planning grounds? So if there were no planning grounds, it would be difficult, however many people you had in the discussion, to then take it through to committee. I can maybe see a situation where even if the planning grounds were, as you've described, a barn in the middle of nowhere, and your rationale for wanting it to come to committee would be around that transparency and decision making and helping maybe a single objector understand the planning reasons why something is allowed, and that's partly the function of a committee in that understanding. I can see that in itself wouldn't be a good planning reason, but it may be that the head of planning made that judgment that it would be something that would be useful for the planning committee to debate and have that debating point on that specific, I don't know, Greenbelt policy. So I'm not sure if that helps in any way. But I mean, ultimately, it's, you know, my suggestion is in front of you. It's for you to support or not.
Thanks. Just before you go on, I think we're agreeing actually that the head of planning will not normally refuse and a member calling in unless it was a completely ridiculous thing. Is that what we're saying? Actually, I don't know how you encompass that in the rules, Claire. But and the other point about the deadline, I think we're all agreed that it's a good idea to do away with it's got to be within the 21 days. What the longer period
Mr. Chairman, just point of information order. We haven't all agreed anything because I haven't spoken yet. So can we not rush ahead with decisions too quickly?
I accept that. I accept that correction, Councillor Ward. My feeling is, I'll rephrase, my feeling is that that's probably the right thing to do, but we will discuss that as a committee. And also we will discuss as a committee the point about whether or not the head of the planning committee should be consulted. So let's let Councillor Goodrich go on to his further points, and then we'll get into the discussion.
But very few points left, you'll be glad to know. The technical one on page 33, paragraph 2.4, I think we should remove Guildford and put in Waverley. Just
Apologies.
to prove to Councillor Hyman that I've read it. And of course, if we change our procedure rules, then the planning code of good practice will need appropriate amendments to go with it. And the points I made about the procedure rules about attending and attending site visits and so on will all go in there as well. The last point I want to make on the Appendix 4, the Memorandum of Understanding, is that I'm always have been in favour of good dialogue between councillors and planners. I mean, that is brilliant, provided you can get hold of the planner, which is sometimes a problem. Has been suggested that if an officer is going to be dealing with the matter under delegated authority, that really councillors shouldn't be interfering. I'm not quite sure how that works in practice. If I, as a councillor, want to speak to an officer and say, well, I'm very much in favour of this condition or that condition, or have you thought about this, or have you thought about the other? Is that interfering with the officer's delegated discretion? Is this something which we should be encouraged to do or not do?
So my invite to you, a message to my team, and I've shared all this obviously with the team and they've given me feedback, is that regardless of whether it's delegated or committee, that dialogue should be going on between you and officers. The fact it's, you know, coming to committee doesn't make it any different. And as members, you know, you're not interfering in anything if you're talking about an application that you have an interest in. The method by which it's approved or refused is not material to that dialogue.
I'll shut up, Mr. Chairman. I've spoken enough, and Councillor Ward is clearly
You've
biting at the bit. Or whatever
you've raised some very good and interesting points there, Michael. So who would like to speak next from the committee members? Councillor Ward.
I was hoping to sit back and let everybody else speak first, but can I very briefly say I totally agree with the points that Councillor Clark made, which I think Head of Planning also agrees with, that if you call something in, you should be here, you should go to the site visit, and you should most certainly acquaint other people with what you believe to have happened. I find myself largely agreeing with the revered gentleman on my right on a number of things, but just to go through a few things that slightly concern me. The call-in procedure. I really am very keen that the chairman should be involved. And this is in no way a reflection on the head of planning or whatever, but I think it does two things. We haven't always had such a competent, open and forthright head of planning in the past. And in the future, we may end up with a rogue head of planning. So I would like to keep the chairman in the loop. But the other thing, and I think which is actually a very valid reason for keeping the chairman in the loop, is that it stops any form of councillor moaning and groaning, oh, the officers this, oh, the officers that, they don't agree with me. If the chairman's in the loop as well, it spreads the blame or spreads the glory, whichever way you like to look at it. So personally, I would like to keep the chairman in there. The number 10 and 20 that bring things to committee, when you read it carefully, that is not automatic. It says if 10 or 20, depending which paragraph you're reading, objections, views contrary to the officers are 10, and then pops in this little word, and the head of planning agrees that there are, whatever it is, planning reasons. So it's not an automatic call-in for 10 or 20. It is still subject to the agreement of the head of planning. I'm just raising that because a lot of people seem to think it's automatic. It's not. There's still a backstop on the head of planning there. And maybe we should pop the chairman in there as well on my earlier theory of sharing the blame and sharing the glory. Going on down, chairs two. When we talk about letters of objection, generally we talk about valid letters, and generally we talk about letters from different households. That seemed to have slipped away, and I would certainly advocate bringing it back. Certainly in my experience in objections in my ward, I've had letters from Northumberland and Berwick-on-Tweed, which I really don't think we could call valid. So if we could get some wording that, you know, if we have a household with 10 children in and they all write in, that's not what we want. We want different households, and we want valid objections, i.e., let's say someone that's affected by it. And I am happy to go with sort of the wording that officers come up with. I'm sort of moving forward through the whole thing, taking a steer from Councillor Goodrich. I do quite like the Goodrich amendment that gets a motion, not necessarily a motion to approve before the council, but I do actually agree with him. We do need some debate beforehand. Otherwise, as you say, we're going to put a motion and then we're going to start debating something that we don't really want to debate. Valid letters. I'm a little unclear, and this may be my reading of it. If a ward councillor is on the committee, they can't speak or vote as a committee member. I'm just a little unclear, whereas when they move off, they have the full rights of 4 minutes at the end, beginning, and 4 minutes at the end, or whether they just have 4 minutes. There was a phrase somewhere in there, I think was 4 minutes towards the end of the meeting, and I put a ring round the 4 towards. So I'm not quite clear on that. And it may be my reading of this rather than anything else. Because generally, I think this is a really good report. It's moving things forward, and I think it's doing a lot of good things. One thing that I really didn't like was somewhere there was a stricture that councillors will not talk to each other or pass notes to each other or speak from a written script. Now, whilst councillors reading out a written script, I think is quite annoying and does cause some difficulty with where they might have come from. the idea that if we three wish to say something to each other during a debate, that it would be against the rules, I find actually unacceptable, but also difficult to police, because we just use our mobile phones and use WhatsApps. And also the idea that you are not allowed to read a script. Yeah, it's a bad thing to do, and I think you should be discouraged. But who's going to police that? Is an officer going to walk around behind me when I'm reading my detailed bullet points and say, oh no, Councillor Ward, that's a script, you can't read that? I think we would be putting councillors and officers in a very difficult position with those two particular things. And I'll dig out where they are in a minute, although you've probably found them well ahead of me. But I really, really didn't like that. I think I've probably covered enough at the moment. Generally, we've had some very good points made by other councillors, and I would really go with them. But as I say, that particular thing I found unable to police, quite irksome, and actually quite likely to cause huge disagreement between various people. So I would like those particular things removed, please. And if I find anything else, please, can I come back later? Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, John. Would you like to respond, Claire?
Just to confirm with the ward speaking, it would be 4 minutes at the beginning and 4 minutes at the end. I think the thing about the script, and I think that was a point that was covered in the member training, it's about that perception that you predetermine something. If you've read, you've written your script before you walk into the meeting and you read it out, have you come in with an open mind because you've already written something down? So it was more that. And I think the sort of the note passing and the whispering is perhaps more about managing the meeting and that perception of the public that, I don't know, if someone's presenting or something and you've got four members, and I'm not saying this does happen, sort of passing each other's notes and whispering, and it's that perception. But again, that in part comes down to the chairing of the meeting.
I understand what you say, and I can live with it is discouraged, but I find it difficult to police it if it is prohibited.
Thank you. I think Vice Chair Councillor Rubini wants to talk now.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I'm not going to say much because, like a lot of others, I agree with what many of the councillors tonight have said. What I would say is that, first of all, 5 or 10 or 20 objectors, the ward councillor can still call it in. And as far as I'm concerned, that's probably the most important point. If you don't know your area, why are you a ward councillor? If people can't approach you, why can't they find you? Well, obviously, you're hiding yourself somewhere where you shouldn't be. So as far as I'm concerned, I like the fallback of the councillor being able to call in. I also like the idea of the ward councillor being able to speak both beginning and the end, and of course not being able to partake in the vote. It frees me up. It allows me to speak to the public and other people without becoming predetermined, because I can't become predetermined because I'm not going to vote. So as far as I'm concerned, that is a very good step forward for me personally, to be able to speak about the planning in my own area to the public who want it. And if I want to then pass it on to another councillor, then they can speak as well if they wish to. But of course, I would underline that when I have my 4 minutes in the front and 4 minutes at the end. What I would say is if I ever call anything, and I always attend, and I would expect every other councillor, if they have a call in, to attend. It's a personal thing, and I hope it is within the rules to attend. Now, I've so far been to 2 planning meetings under the new rules, and I found them efficient. I found that they finished on time. I think the last one we had was 8:30, and I remember sitting here at some meetings till 10:30. So I'm finding that actually this does work, and it was quite interesting to hear the ward members speak in their 4 minutes at the beginning and the end. So I personally like these movements. I think these rules are going to work well. I think it's going to become a much more efficient panel. And yes, there will be a lot of debate. And of course, at the end of the day, planning meeting is about lines on a bit of paper and rules. That's it in a short way. Although I like the local input, really it is a planning matter and planning rules. And I've often heard at meetings where these planning rules are not actually adhered to by the members. So I do find this might, with the presence of the officers, actually be better and more efficient. Certainly with a mix right across the borough, instead of just having a Western with only 2 areas represented. So I think that's a good, fair point. So all in all, I find this a much more efficient one. I would agree, I think, with Councillor Ward about the chair. I think the chair should be involved in discussions. Mind you, I would say that we could have a bad chair as well as a bad head of office, but let's not go there. As far as I'm concerned, let's have a discussion between the head of planning and the chair to make sure that whatever's going through or not going through, they agree with, because it is planning rules and the chairman should know those planning rules. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, John. I'm not sure that Claire needs to respond to anything because I think you've been very supportive of what's happening. So unless there's anything you want to say, Claire, thank you. Councillor Janet Crowe would like to speak next.
So I'm completely new to planning, so I'm not in a position to be able to compare this with anything that's gone on before, really, not intelligently anyway. But I've just got a few, I mean, I think it certainly seems to be making a lot of sense to me. And some of the principles that you're discussing tonight, which I think I can address because they're principles rather than the minutiae. I do think the removal of a 21-day limit makes a lot of sense. So very happy with that. I think it's absolutely essential that ward members are generally empowered. So any proper empowering of ward members, ward councillors that we can do is always going to be a very, very good thing, because not least it keeps things well connected in all sorts of ways and on all sorts of topics, actually. But it does also mean that ward members get to take some responsibility for what they're doing. And I think they should. And I agree with the motions that they should be here, you know, promote their cause and all the rest of it. But I also believe that it's quite right that they don't vote at the end of it all, because it's protecting them and indeed everybody else from accusations of bias. So that seems to be a very good inbuilt protection. Completely take the point about that thing on 2.12, that debate question thing, that makes sense to have the debate. I also think there is something around the optics about not just having something being called in by the ward councillor, which is great and does protect rural wards where there are not enough people to object to something. That's a great safeguard and addresses the issue probably quite well, I imagine. But I think also there is something around the optics of it not just being the head of planning. I think it looks good if it's the head of planning and the chair of the committee. It's a good look. And I don't see why, maybe it's because I don't know enough about it, but I don't see what harm that would do. I just think it looks good for the general public to see that it is not just one individual, you know, taking that decision. I think that's all I had to say. Thank you. Oh, sorry, may I just make one plea? I think site visits, absolutely. The more we see of these, of sort of maybe the more complicated applications, the better. I would just make a plea for some flexibility, because I can really see that not everybody's going to be able to make a Tuesday. But I know that's complicated, the logistics. Thank you.
Janet, is there anything you'd like to respond to, Claire?
No, Chair.
Member who hasn't spoken yet is Councillor Gemma Long. Would you like to speak, Gemma?
I agree with many of the things that have been said. I like the removal of the 21-day rule. When I first read that, my concern was that this would add cost by things being called in very late. But I think that the addition of the reasonably practicable wording solves that problem. Completely agree that where a ward councillor calls in an application, it's courtesy that they should then attend. And also the point about being present for the whole of the presentation and debate is important. And And yeah, the fact that the ward councillor can always call it in, for me, removes the concern about threshold numbers. So, yeah.
Right, thank you very much, Chairman. Well, we've got 4 items. Oh, sorry, Councillor Goodrich wants to come back. No
One
problem.
new point, and to endorse Councillor Ward's thing about the pre-prepared speeches, which is on page 46, 22.3. A lot of councillors cannot ad lib at meetings. I can, because that's the way I am, but some can't. And it seems to me, if someone's pre-prepared a speech which starts, I haven't made my mind up yet and I wish to listen to the debate, but, and then go on to say what they want to say, why should that not be pre-prepared? I mean, we've all been advised to make it quite clear that at a planning meeting, you don't say, you know, over my dead body, this one's going to be passed and I've never been in favor of it and it's a disaster. I mean, you know, we know that's stupid. And most people will say, you know, I'm listening to the debate and I haven't made my mind up, but my views are at this stage. And then they may have a pre-prepared speech, because I think we've got to be careful. Some councillors, and I don't know the speaking ability of the current people on the planning committee, will find it difficult to speak, particularly when there's a lot of detail, without having some pretty comprehensive notes, which either is a speech or it's, you know, every other word has been written down on their tablet or whatever. So I agree that I think we're in a dangerous position there. The second point I wanted to make on page 28, 211, a member of the planning committee, they will exclude taking part in the debate and vote on that planning application. They must step away from the planning committee, and this is the bit I don't like, to the public speaking area. Well, I think in practice what's going to happen, if I was on the planning committee and I'm not, and I had to declare, and it was in my ward, and I would go to the back of the council chamber where the councillors are at the moment who aren't on this committee, rather than going over there, which is where the public speaking area is. I mean, just looking at the practicalities, what do we intend by saying that the planning committee member must step away from the planning committee? I can see that. You've got to separate them from the rest who are debating it. But have they got to go to the public speaking area? Question.
If I can comment just before I pass to Claire, I think you and Councillor Ward have made some very good points there, actually. I agree about the written notes. In fact, you are allowed to be predisposed. You're not allowed to be predetermined. So I think that sort of makes the point that you're making, that you can come into the meeting with notes or even a prepared speech. And I think the way you got around the problem by saying that the person who is speaking from a prepared note should stay at the beginning, that they haven't totally made up their mind and that they will listen to what other councillors say. So I think that covers that one. In terms of the moving to the back of the room, that's actually what happened in practice. I think at the 2 meetings that have happened so far, the people didn't move to the public speaking area. So public speaking area is probably the wrong term. They actually moved to the area that the other councillors were sitting, and I think that's what should happen, actually. I agree with that. At the first meeting, it was slightly unfortunate that 1 or 2 new members actually sat amongst the committee members, and that's to be discouraged. Actually, they should be told, if anybody sits where the committee is sitting, they should be asked to move to the back of the room. And equally, I think that the committee members, when they speak as ward councillors, they should be asked to move to the back of the room, Claire. So I'll let you respond now, Claire.
Yeah, you, Chair, you're right. In the last 2 committees, we've had the members moving right to the back row. So if we're happy, we can say move to the back row rather.
And for public perception, I suppose if we had it in the procedure rules or the other document, the one after that, planning code of good practice, that members of the committee who are voting are going to be sitting at the front, and those councillors that have an interest in an application or a ward member will sit at the back. So people viewing the chamber from the public gallery can see, well, those are the people who are going to be deciding it, and those at the back aren't. I mean, it's just perception, isn't it?
Would you be happy, Claire, if we can come up with some slightly different words about speaking from a prepared script that allows people to come in with notes, etc., etc., that doesn't ban them from thinking that they can do that? Yeah, Councillor Ward.
Thank you. I think Councillor Goodrich has raised a very good point there. I mean, I think we understand what the meaning is here, but it isn't obvious, say, to members of the public or newer councillors who may end up treading on the public's toes in order to escape the wrath of the committee. So I think moving to the rear of the chamber makes perfect sense. Unfortunately, Chairman, I have to confess that Councillor Goodrich and I have sinned greatly, because if you look at page 46, 22.2, we have had a little communication between ourselves during this debate. And really, I think that strengthens my view that to try and prohibit that would be unworkable and needs to go or be changed.
I noticed that, but this isn't the planning committee, of course. There's no rule.
Am I in the wrong room?
Yeah,
but I think you get my gist.
Absolutely, yes. Again, we can see if we can come up with some slightly better words there, Claire, if we can.
Yes, certainly.
Yeah, I disagree completely with that. I completely agree with that. I think it just makes us all look like we're naughty children. Yeah, and you know, I don't think we are. And I think it's a question of manners. And most of us are perfectly good mannered people, and we're not going to sort of disrupt the proceedings by muttering. And if we do, the chairman or chairperson will have to tell us to stop.
Are normally pretty good, and as of the mayor at the main council meeting and sorting these problems out. Sometimes members do misbehave a little bit, but generally speaking, our chairman and mayor, etc., manage it pretty well. Okay. Thank you. If everybody's finished speaking, we now have to run through the 4 things that we're going to recommend to the council and see what changes that we want Claire to make, just to make sure we've picked up the important points. So if you take the first one that we're recommending to the council, the proposed scheme of delegation as attached in Appendix 1A, do we want to make some specific changes to that arising from our discussion? If we make sure we can pick up the various ones that people wanted made. Susan had volunteered to summarise, which is very helpful.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, if it's helpful, just to summarise the discussion of some of the proposals that have been suggested that you might want to vote on. You may want to consider voting on the recommendations before you, but perhaps with the delegation to the head of planning to make these changes that you have discussed, if that suits you. The first one was about ward councillors being expected to be at a committee meeting and a site visit if they have called in an application. The second one was a slight amendment to page 46, paragraph 22.3, about prepared speeches, notes and whispering being discouraged rather than prohibited. Then a decision to accept call-in being amended from being simply by the head of planning to be the head of planning in consultation with the chair of the planning committee. Then page 28, paragraph 2.12, where it talks about questions and then an invitation to make a motion that there should be questions, then debate, then consideration of an alternative motion. Page 28, 2.11, about councillors stepping away from the committee table, not necessarily going to the speaking area. And the need to be present for the whole agenda item to be able to cast a vote. And a minor typo on page 33. I think that captures most of the points that were
I
raised.
think that's extremely helpful, Susan, that you did that. Is there any points that anyone thinks isn't included in Susan's list that's been missed? I rather doubt it.
Just pedantically, it's 22.2 was what I was arguing about, and 22.3 was what Councillor Goodrich was arguing about.
Okay. Have you got that, Susan? So I will agree that that is the list of changes that we want to see made
I think that's an excellent summary.
before it goes to full council. So if Claire can arrange that and circulate it to all members of the committee, so we can look at what the changes are, and I'm sure it will be fine. But if there's any concerns about anyone, if they can come back to Susan and myself to let us know. Otherwise, I think that really covers everything to do with that that item on the agenda. Yeah, can I just ask, Susan wants to make sure that we're all agreed. Is that all agreed by all members of the committee?
Agreed.
Agreed. It is agreed. Thank you, Susan. Okay.
Chairman, could I just ask a question on the memorandum of understanding? How is that on a practical way going to be brought forward? How are we going to involve all 50 members in considering that?
So in terms of how I'm going to involve all 50 members, it will just be a round robin email inviting all members to come back to me with their individual suggestions, and then go through those and then bring a report back to the next this next meeting to say, you know, this is what I've been suggested, this is what I'm recommending, and then we can have a debate as we've had this evening.
One point I did need to make earlier, I'll just make it now, is that we have received a letter from Yolanda Hess, who's the chairman of the Farm Society Planning Committee, making one or two suggestions, particularly in relation to design issues. And I think that's been circulated to every member of the committee. And we will respond to that, Claire. I don't actually think it affects any of the recommendation we're making here, but we will respond to Yolanda's letter. Okay, let's move on to the next item, which is the review of various borough constitution. And Susan's going to present the report on this.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, just to introduce it briefly. The constitution is clearly a statutory requirement that every council has a constitution. It's also a requirement that the constitution is reviewed regularly and is kept up to date and is made publicly available. So it's really a constant review process from a local authority's constitution. I know several councils have ongoing review groups, working parties that carry out at least an annual review or ad hoc throughout the year. The current situation is that there are some obvious areas of the constitution that do need review. So, for example, the council has appointed some joint officers now together with Guildford Borough Council, but we don't have some joint employment procedure rules which would encompass the legal requirements about, for example, dismissal or other staffing matters relating to joint senior officers. So there is a gap in the constitution in terms of that arrangement. There are also some other areas such as the scheme of officer delegations, where it's difficult for officers who are undertaking a shared role to be dealing with some areas that are becoming more working in partnership with Guildford, that they have very different schemes of delegation. So it's an opportunity to review the officer scheme of delegations and see whether there are any changes that members would like to make to delegate differently to officers, or indeed that the executive, the leader, may wish to make in terms of delegations to individual executive members too. So officers are keen to start working with members in terms of the review of the constitution, And it feels as if this is a good opportunity to carry out that review together with colleagues from Guildford Borough Council. There is no suggestion of the result being one single constitution. We're very clear that there are two separate councils, they maintain their sovereignty and they must maintain separate constitutions. It's more a question of taking the opportunity of reviewing the constitutions together, aligning them where there is a will to do so and where it's appropriate to do so, whilst accepting that there will always be some differences as well, and having the opportunity to work in collaboration on the review to take good practice from both areas and elsewhere. So the proposal before you is that a review group is established to act as a working group jointly with members from Guildford Borough Council. It's proposed that it be a joint constitutions review group comprising of 4 members, 4 from Waverley and 4 from Guildford, and that review group undertakes some work and brings back recommendations to this committee and also to the equivalent similar committee at Guildford. So this committee would hear those recommendations themselves and would be able to make their own decision whether they want to make recommendations to Waverley Borough Council. So the proposal before you is to 3 recommendations: to establish a joint review group, to approve its terms of reference, and to make appointments of 4 members to that group. The terms of reference are attached to the report as Appendix 1. You will see that it's proposed that the membership be appointed by this committee, because it will be a working group of this committee, but that it's not mandatory that the members appointed to that working group are members of this committee. We felt it's beneficial to give you as wide range as possible so that you can utilise the skills that you have amongst members to be on this committee, but the recommendations will still come back to you. It's further proposed that to be core, the review group will need to have members of both councils present at each of their meetings, so it cannot take place with just Guildford members in attendance, and that both authorities appoint a chair and that they alternate and become co-chairman of the review group and alternate that role. If the meetings take place in person, we'll also suggest that the location is alternated, although they may also want to meet remotely. Also in the terms of reference, just to highlight the last clause about voting. Obviously, it's not a decision-making group. It does just make recommendations back to you, but we still felt it prudent to include something in there about the way in which what they decide they're going to recommend, how those decisions are made. So it will be on a vote, but there is a provision that if there is a discussion about an aspect that simply relates to the Waverley Borough Council constitution, in effect, Guildford members can't outvote the vote of Waverley members present. So it does protect your sovereignty in that way. Happy to take any questions, Chair.
Thank you, Claire. That's a very helpful summary. Let's first of all, before we get into questions, go to the speakers. We've got 2 speakers on this subject, Councillor Jerry Hyman. First of all, so Jerry, you've got 4 minutes again.
Thank you very much indeed, Leader. Yes, well, if we're going to be reviewing the Constitution and rewriting it, members should, of course, be aware that that's exactly what they've been doing for the past hour and a half nearly, because the scheme of delegation is part of the Constitution and we've been rewriting it on the hoof. That's not good decision making. Certainly what's in front of us could hamper further good decision making, because obviously the changes are going to be made by a joint committee rather than by the standards, but by our own standards committees. And if we've got different aims, because the whole point we're being told, I think the paragraph 3.1 or something like that, yeah, 3.1, the purpose, page 64. If it's to achieve our aims and goals and ours are different from Guildford's, obviously we don't have the same corporate strategy. Unless we have the same corporate strategy, then really it would seem to me that it's exactly the same question as with the previous item, which I unfortunately didn't get an answer to, but where is the evidence to support the need for this? We haven't seen the evidence, and that's not good decision making. We need to see the evidence to support the need for this, because there's already been a model code of conduct put together by the government. Why shouldn't there be a model constitution for districts and boroughs that don't have an all-powerful mayor or whatever, which there are hundreds of in the country? Why should we not save our time, save ourselves lots of work, certainly not have annual reviews, because annual reviews are ridiculous. The idea of a constitution is it's the rules that are set to get to your goals. So that should be okay for 4 years, certainly one administration at a time. Changes should be made in order to make it easier and more efficient for us to achieve our goals. That's why we would do it. So it's there. We fix problems when they come up. You don't wait for another year if you find you've got problems and then fix it later. You do what's best for our residents, because that's the question. Why are we here? We're here to serve our residents and provide the best thing we can. And for us to spend our time rewriting the constitution, we did it last October. Fiona spent hours and hours, put in a massive amount of work, completely rejigging the constitution 8 months ago. And now we're overturning the work that was done there. And a lot of it was very good work. There was a little bit of snagging needed, but it was a lot of hard work. And to say we're going to do this all over again now, when quite obviously it'd be a lot more efficient if we were to get the government to produce a model constitution, and then all of us, you know, Guildford, ourselves, and then other places which we might join together with at some point, all try and align things rather than doing it over and over again. So this simply doesn't make sense to me, with particularly the annual review. But we do need evidence-based decision making, and there's no evidence here to suggest why we have to do this now. The annual review is just making work for ourselves, really, and we ought to do it properly. We shouldn't be doing it every 8 months or every year. If you would look in terms of reference on page 69 quickly, the frequency of meetings for the joint board, I've no objection to it being done, but I just think there's a better way of doing it. We should consider the options. Frequency as and when required. Well, that's really not aiming for a goal, is it? I mean, where's the purpose behind this if we're saying, well, we just do it when we need to? And at 7.1 on page 65, it says the benefits of aligning governance processes of the constitutions of the two councils are becoming increasingly apparent. That's the information we need in front of us to make decisions here, or you need in front of you to make a decision tonight on this, whether to go ahead with this, a lot of hard work, or whether we look for better ways of doing things rather than repeating the work over and over again and duplication of effort across the country, all unnecessary. We could save a lot of time and money doing this properly. We want the details. Where are the benefits of aligning it? Wouldn't we be better off if the government were to produce a model, or if we were to help the government to produce a model one, so that we don't have to repeat ourselves over and over again, because it's masses of work for this committee and all members and officers particularly, of course. So what are the examples of the flaws? That's what I'd like to know. What are the problems with our constitution that's stopping us achieving our goals?
I think your time's up, I'm afraid.
Thanks. And that's the question. Thanks.
Thank you for your contribution. Our next speaker is Councillor Paul Follows.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Alongside Councillor Keel, I'm one of the portfolio holders for governance. I'm obviously completely in support of the proposals in part 10. There is actually plenty of evidence to support doing something about some of the issues with our constitution. First of all, we begin to address some of the inconsistencies between Waverley and Guildford. Some of these things have become more noticeable the more work that we are doing. So, for example, there is a session where we need to discuss joint matters in a couple of weeks' time, and it's necessary to schedule within a reasonable time period an executive meeting and a council meeting of both councils to authorise it. So there are little things coming up here and there that mean that we do really need to have some kind of shared governance for some of the issues that impact both councils simultaneously. I am also personally quite keen that we explore some of the executive delegations, more specifically because there aren't any, except for Councillor Paul Rivers, which we added in for the portfolio holder for housing when we set up the Landlord Services Board. We have an extremely centralised system where almost all the decision making that's not codified in the Constitution or reserved to council ends up with me. And frankly, that's not a particularly good setup. And so I actually really want to explore what are a sensible set of delegated powers and financial spend to members of the executive individually. And I think it's an entirely reasonable thing for us to do. The only thing I absolutely agree with that Councillor Hyman said there is that, yes, you should set these things up and try and do that for 4 years. It is the start of a new administration. There are a number of things that have changed, particularly with collaboration. And there are a number of new things that people are going to be wanting to do post the election. So this is the time to do this. And there are a number of justifications to doing this. I completely support the point that Fiona put in a great amount of work for the revisions that we've already had. They were absolutely necessary, and the vast majority of them will probably still stand in some form or another. I'm obviously not going to put too many words in Fiona's mouth, but I know she will be she'll be first in the line, I suspect, for jumping at the bit to make some further changes to the Constitution, probably with me right behind. I was actually keen to set this up as an executive working group. I would, it was far more appropriate for the Standards Committee to have it as a working group, so I completely accept that. I was actually going to use this time to ask the committee if they would consider having an executive member as one of the 4. And the reasons for that are because having an executive member who's been working with the collaboration can bring that additional context. And in terms of getting the buy-in, both Standards Committee and full council and executive, I think it'd be useful to have a Waverley executive member present on the committee. Just for transparency of everybody else, I have had those discussions with the chairman and vice chairman, and I believe that their proposal is that there be one member of the executive. And should the committee accept that proposal, I am proposing myself as one of the portfolio holders for governance in that role. And if you're content to allow this, Councillor Keel to be my substitute, so that you will always have one of us present to provide that role. Otherwise, I just want to say thank you for taking this all so seriously, as it should be. The rest of the terms of reference mirrors the sorts of arrangements we have for the other Joint Governance Committee in terms of what's the legitimate quorum for the meeting, and who's going to be the chair. I very much hope that we can do as many of these meetings with remote access as possible, because this is one where moving around the borough is going to, and another borough is going to be quite problematic. So my request would be that we at least have that ability to remotely join in this, as we do for most working groups. But otherwise, absolutely support this. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Paul. Would you like to respond there to what Councillor Hyman and Councillor Fuller have said?
Yes, thank you, Chair. So there were a few points raised in there, particularly by Councillor Hyman. Councillor Hyman made the point that, of course, we have just been reviewing the Constitution in terms of the scheme of delegations for planning, and of course that's absolutely right. That, of course, came about because of the decision to change the planning committees. So your Constitution is there to empower you, enable good governance arrangements, and to protect the system of governance. So it has to be reactive. So when you set up a new committee, it is right and proper that we look at the delegations that go alongside it and the protocols and practices that go alongside it. So that's the reason that that's been done piecemeal, because it was reactive to a change in the committee structure. But what we are trying to do is to set up this joint working group so that we don't look at things piecemeal, so that we now look at the scheme of officer delegations in the round, in context, and have a more planned approach going forwards over the next year, rather than doing things on the hoof. I think Councillor Hyman made a reference to decisions being made by a joint committee. Just to stress, as I said in the introduction, it's a joint working group, but any recommendations from that working group will come back to 2 separate committees who will make recommendations to their separate councils. So there's no joint decision making being proposed here. It's joint work on recommendations. That's as far as it's proposed to go at this stage. There was a question about where is the evidence to support the need for this. I think I mentioned a couple of specific issues in the introduction, so particularly around where you have already made some joint appointments of senior officers, and we haven't quite got the governance processes in place and the constitutional arrangements in place to support those joint appointments at the moment. But it's a moving feast. Both councils are evolving, particularly in terms of the collaboration agenda. And to enable you to move forwards with that programme, you do need a responsive constitution that keeps up with matters to provide that change to be protected and robust. I think Councillor Hyman was obviously making reference to the excellent work that's been done on the Constitution previously. It absolutely has, and there's no suggestion at all that we would be overturning the work that's been done. It's more about evolving, that the Constitution should continuously evolve and keep up with what the Council is trying to do. And in terms of a model code, there was actually a model code a few years ago, and you can see various councils across the country have perhaps started with that model code, and it has evolved and now has several changes in it, but you can see some similarities in the basics in several constitutions. But there was also talk of fixing problems as they come up, being able to address your own corporate issues and being able to be reactive to your own residents. And I hope it's really clear that the proposal is to share good practice where appropriate and where you wish to do so. It's not to constrain you to align with Guildford if that doesn't suit your own corporate priorities at all. So it is accepted that there may be areas you wish to align, but there will, I'm sure, be differences in your constitution that you want to maintain, and that's absolutely fine as well. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Claire. If I can just pick up on the point that Councillor Fowler's made. The Vice Chair and I have had discussions about what we should recommend to the committee for the membership of this joint constitutional review group. And our suggestion actually was that to reflect the membership of the council broadly, it should have 2 Lib Dem members, 1 Farnham resident member and 1 Conservative member. And our suggestion was, the way it's evolved, we then took on board Councillor Fowler's suggestion that one member of the executive would be helpful as one of the 2 Lib Dem members. So the proposal that we'd like to put to the committee is that the 4 members should be myself as representing as the Farnham resident, Councillor Goodrich as a Conservative, and that the 2 Lib Dem members should be Councillor Long, Councillor Gemma Long, and Councillor Fowler himself, with Victoria Keogh, Councillor Victoria Keogh as a substitute, because Councillor Fowler is a pretty busy guy, as is Councillor Keogh for that matter. But one of them, one of the others will attend the meetings. So that's what we're going to propose to the committee for the membership. But before we do that formally, let's throw this open for discussion to whoever wants to make comments. So first of all, the Vice Chairman, Councillor.
Thank you, Chair. I thought it was a good document, and underlining the fact that it's not a joining of 2 councils. It is 2 councils coming together in a partnership, and we reserve our sovereignty, and that has to be reinforced. There's a lot of rumours about how Guildford and Waverley are joining. We're not. Let's dispel that myth completely. We're doing it for partly economic reasons and other reasons as well, but mainly for economic reasons. My question is on page 69 under the joint constitutions review, and it says here the appointed members do not have to be members of the committee appointing them, and then it says political balance rules do not need to apply. But under substitutes, it then says a group may be substituted by any other member of their political group on the council they represent. I'm not sure we need that. Can we take the political grouping of the council out so that any other member can come on? Otherwise, of course, if we have 1 Labour councillor, they cannot substitute because there's no other Labour councillor on there. So if we could take that reference out, please.
Claire, do you want to respond to that?
Thanks. Thank you, Chair. Yes, that would be absolutely fine. Because it's a working group, there's no requirement for it to be politically balanced, although it's probably good practice to roughly reflect the balance of the council, I think. You could have substitutes from anybody else in the council. That would be fine. And I take on board the point that for smaller groups, that would be easier. I would simply say that it probably should be the absent member who selects who their substitute is. But that would be fine. Thank you.
The one group that isn't represented, of course, is the small green Labour group. And as Janet is actually the only member of that who isn't on the executive, we thought it'd be unfair to suggest she came onto this committee because she's on so many committees already, but not committee onto this working group. So that's why we didn't include you, Janet, not because we want to keep the Labour and Green out of it, but
That's
you
absolutely
may be
fine.
asked to be a substitute
Thank
on
you.
odd occasions.
That's fine. Thank you. Well, I just want to say that there's been so much change, obviously. I mean, the Guildford Waverley thing, I mean, just so much change, new administration, all the rest of it. It seems to me extremely timely to undertake a review of this sort. A review should never be something that throws the baby out with the bathwater, and all the work that's done before should always feed into this, and I'm sure that's the intention. But also, I mean, these things can't stand still. They have to evolve. They have to be a bit flexible, you know, in order to sort of, like a building, breathe and sort of expand and all the rest of it. So I'm very much in favour of doing this review, and I'm very much in favour of the composition that you are probably going to propose to us to vote on.
Does anyone else like to speak? Councillor Goodrich.
Just on the substitution point, I'm happy to be on the working group, but and if one is putting in the rules that the person who's absent can pick their own substitute, if that, on the one hand, we think it's fair that we should be politically balanced, and then if it's left to the, for example, if I can't attend and I want someone from my group to attend in my absence, then have we got to have a list of who the substitutes are, or is it all 46 members of the council are technically available to be substitutes? Not 46, how many have we got? Yes, 46. 50 minus 4.
Yeah, through you, Chair. The proposal is, again, it's a working group, not a committee. Doesn't need to be quite as formal. So the proposal is it could be from any other councillors.
I mean, on planning committees, of course, any member of the council can substitute, provided they've been through planning training. But we don't have equivalent training here, so I guess I'm talking about any member who existing member thinks is appropriate. Anyone else? Councillor Ward or Councillor Long? No. Okay, that's good. Okay, well, all we need to do is now formally ask the committee to approve the proposed membership of the group and the recommendations that Claire had read out earlier. So are members happy with the membership I referenced earlier? Great, good. And are they happy with the recommendations that Claire read out earlier? Was there anything that needs to be specifically referenced?
No, Chair, just subject to that minor amendment about substitutes in the terms of reference.
That's fine.
Members are happy.
Okay, well, thank you everybody for attending the meeting. I just want to say finally, actually, I very much agreed with the comments that Councillor Rabini made earlier, that the new planning committee seems to have worked well. I certainly was a member of as a substitute of the first meeting, and I watched the second meeting. I'll watch a few more, but it seems to be working well so far. Particularly the issue about how ward members can come off the committee and talk as ward members. So I'm just happy that what we're doing so far seems to be working out well so far, but we're meant to see what happens as time goes by. And we will be reviewing all these things in a year's time. So thank you everybody for attending. It's slightly longer than I hoped, but I think we had a very good discussion. Thank you everybody for attending. You'll hear from Claire with the proposed changes soon. Thank you.